Two world wars tore the heart out of the 20th century. They are a rent in the fabric of history. Between the wars, there was progress. There was optimism, there was ignorance, and there was greed. Economies were fragile, peace precarious, and people started listening to the claims of those who said they had the answers. Exchange rates and floundering economies were not the only things influencing how and where people lived. The motor car and other modern marvels were transformative, though some hung on to the past.
The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, bigotry in bedsheets, the ignorant, the unbalanced, the venal completely pervert the motto, "Make America safe for Americans."
Hiram Evans, a Dallas dentist, had taken control of the Ku Klux Klan, and in 1925, he led 40,000 Klansmen down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue. But the sensational fall of corrupt KKK leaders in Indiana and Colorado undermined confidence in the organization, and it started to recede. In Italy, support for a fascist regime was tracking in the other direction. In 1925, a slogan authored by a journalist named Leo Longanisi began to circulate, to be broadcast, to appear on posters. And it was meant seriously. Mussolini ha sempre ragione, it said. Mussolini is always right.
He may or may not say something significant about fascist policy, but if you write that up on a wall in some peasant village, the peasants blink and say, "Oh, Mussolini's always right, good."
On April the 28th, 1925, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons to deliver the budget speech, return Britain to the gold standard, and, according to his own later assessment, make the greatest mistake of his life.
Going back on the gold standard at the 1914 exchange rate was a message which the financiers liked to present to the world. This was London, the financial centre, back at the centre of things. Normality had been restored.
The price of normality was belt-tightening that would, in 1926, result in a general strike.
One of the great moments was 1926, when Aristide Briand welcomed Stresemann, the German foreign minister, to the League of Nations. It was an absolute moment of incredible hope.
We have done with the black veils of mourning for sufferings that can never be appeased, Briand said. Done with war, done with sanguinary methods of settling our disputes. Away with rifles, clear the way for conciliation, arbitration, peace.
Il faut leur arracher le poison des mains. Et ça,
That's what he said. But what Briand would have seen if he looked around the world that he claimed was done with war would have given him little cause for confidence.
Modern China, in spite of its age-old history, was like the broken pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each piece controlled by a different ruler, each with his own private army. In modern terms, China was a country, but not yet a nation.
On July the 4th in China, the man who had risen to leadership of the Republican government, Chiang Kai-shek, announced the Northern Expedition. It aimed at unifying China under a central government, ending the fiefdoms of the warlords and, in time, extinguishing opposition. In India, riots based on sectarian rivalry and inflamed by the rumor that the British were about to withdraw continued to pockmark the subcontinent interwar history. In 1926, there were 40 riots in Calcutta alone. Marshal Piłsudski, who was head of the democratically elected government of Poland, declared a coup d'etat and became military dictator at the head of the Colonels Group. He was the second in a long, long line of dictators who would take control of European countries in the decades ahead. The first, Benito Mussolini, having survived 3 assassination attempts, transformed Italy into a true one-party state. By the time he assumed the absolute role, it is estimated that 13 million pictures of Il Duce in 2,500 poses were in circulation. There are parallels to this photographic profligacy in both Hitler and Stalin. Perhaps simply because every portrait, poster, postcard, and postage stamp of me is not a picture of someone else. In Britain, the general strike between the 3rd and 13th of May, 1926, was triggered by employers in the coal industry deciding to reduce miners' wages to offset falling prices.
It's general in the sense that the transport and coal industries are entirely called out, and then you also get the press going on strike, and towards the end of the strike, the electrical industry joins in it. It's the largest strike in British history.
850,000 miners struck, and 1.5 million workers came out in support. But there was to be no revolution. In fact, the British Trades Union Congress rejected money sent from Russia. And the strikers, which must have completely baffled left-wingers all over the continent, played a football match against the police, which they won, 2-1. The general strike collapsed after 10 days. The miners lasted 6 months before being forced to accept defeat, longer hours, lower wages, and humiliation. In France, the franc, which in 1914 had stood at 25.22 to the dollar, was by July 1926 trading at 238 to the dollar. Nationalist sentiment was on the rise. Thousands marched, and the war debt, from which the Americans were prepared to offer no relief, continued to menace the peace.
You also have the rise of right-wing, monarchist and fascist leagues, as they were called, extra-parliamentary organisations, many of them with the support of veterans organisations, veterans who felt that they had won the war only to lose the peace to politicians who couldn't make up their minds or make the economy work.
Amidst rumours of a right-wing coup, a government was formed under Raymond Poincaré, with 4 former prime ministers in its ranks. Americans who could cross the Atlantic for $80 and live in Paris improbably cheaply flocked to the French capital.
There's one foreign entanglement that nobody who can afford it objects to. an entanglement with France, which usually means Paris, and more people can afford it than ever before.
By 1926, it was estimated that 45,000 Americans were living in Paris. A handful of them were well known, and every summer their ranks were swollen by 200,000 tourists. By December, the franc had stabilized at 25 to the dollar. American expatriate bohemians were starting to feel the pinch, and Poincaré said that through their efforts his countrymen were struggling free of the yoke of Anglo-Saxon finance. In a similar assertion of nationalist spleen, 1926 saw the introduction of a compulsory Heil Hitler greeting and salute among National Socialist Party members, as an outward sign of their bond with their leader, their Führer. In America, it was not politicians who made the headlines. Rudolph Valentino, aged only 31, died in 1926. So did the actress Barbara Lamar, known as the girl who is too beautiful. Forgotten now, but headlines then. 5 times married and dead at 29.
This is the time when, is Washington the key American power center, or is it the other side of the country in California, or is it Hollywood?
Now, that manifests itself in a series of mergers and acquisitions, so we would now say, which is the start of Hollywood, the film factory. And we all know the name to this day of MGM and Paramount and Warner's and Fox and so on.
American producers are bringing over foreign directors, mainly German, as fast as they can pry them loose, reported Moving Picture World. And so they were. Names that, then and now, lit up the movies with style, wit, and elegance. The world did not only hunger for American movies, the world was dancing to the sound of America. The Savoy Ballroom, an enormous place that occupied an entire Harlem block, opened its doors in 1926. It had 2 bands positioned at opposite ends of the hall, playing alternating sets. Non-stop music that induced, said Carl van Vechten, writer and photographer, intense excitement akin to religious mania.
You listen very differently to jazz than you listen to classical music. You're supposed to move. In fact, it's kind of not normal not to move in a way. You're sort of almost expected to.
At the high point of the 20s, there was the little black dress. It was, American Vogue declared in October 1926, Chanel's Ford. It was, Vogue said, the frock that all the world will wear. Dresses were still called frocks, coats were mantles, and ladies' trousers were slacks, their suits costumes. Coco Chanel would, perhaps, have delighted in the idea of a Chanel Ford. She once said, "I don't create fashion for 3 or 4 tarts."
Another important development in the 1920s is menswear, not least because of, the dapper Prince of Wales being photographed, on the golf course wearing +4s and Fair Isle sweaters, and the whole sort of trend for sportswear in America.
All this froth and bubble did not distract everyone. By the end of 1926, the central bankers had their eyes on 3 storm clouds that threatened to dump on their parade. The US stock market bubble, with more and more money being sucked into Wall Street, the high level of German foreign borrowing, and the increasingly brittle gold standard. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis didn't speak for many, but he spoke prophetically when he said, "I wish to record my utter inability to understand why a lot of folks don't go broke." A short 3 years later, a lot of folks went very broke indeed, a result of what John Kenneth Galbraith called their mass escape into make-believe.
The big problem in China was once the empire collapsed, it very soon fragmented. A whole lot of warlords emerged in different regions of China. There was no natural geopolitical grouping of all these different Chinese provinces.
In March 1927, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the communist militia in the army that he commanded disarmed. On April the 12th, and behind the declaration that the Chinese Revolution must free itself of Russian influence, Chiang launched his anti-communist purge.
Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader who succeeded Sun Yat-sen, was very clear early on that he would not allow his communist allies to become rivals, and therefore, when he had come to power in 1927, he brutally turned on his communist allies, first in the city of Shanghai and then in Canton, murdering, massacring many thousands of them.
60,000 members of the Communist Party of China were alive at the commencement of the purge. By the end of 1927, no more than 10,000. And thousands of peasants had been killed in what has become known as the White Terror. And what all that meant for China and the world would not be resolved until the war still more than a decade away. The shock of the anti-communist slaughter rocked Moscow, which thought it saw the hand of British imperialism in everything.
Moscow, capital of Soviet Russia, is the scene of a dramatic trial. It is alleged that Trotsky, the unseen prisoner in the dock, is the mastermind behind a great plot to smash up the Soviet regime.
Russia buzzed with rumors of war and sent Trotsky and Zinoviev into exile. Stalin was clearly atop the pile.
The party had grown enormously after the Russian Revolution in 1917. It had absorbed or destroyed all the other institutions in Russia, so there were no more independent institutions. And so Stalin had in his hands the levers of great power in the Soviet Union, and he used them.
Stalin's commitment to socialism in one country rather than world revolution led to the first 5-year plan, launched at the Party Congress of 1927. The plan demanded a 110% increase in coal production, 200% in iron production, and 335% in electric power. The jewels in Stalin's crown were to be the dam on the Dnieper for hydroelectric power, the steel city of Magnitogorsk, and coercive collectivization.
The collectivization of agriculture was designed to kind of pay for industrialization by getting the peasants to produce more, but not necessarily pay them more.
In 1927, only 2% of Soviet farmland was held by the state. The rest was divided into peasant farms worked by 24 million households, all of which were to be forcibly collectivized by Stalin's decree in 1929. In Japan, an April financial crisis brought down the liberal government. It was replaced by the conservative Sayakai Party. General Tanaka announced his intention of pursuing expansion into China north of the Great Wall, into Manchuria. Tanaka's government collapsed when the international powers recognized the authority of the Chinese Republican government over Chinese territory, including the 3 provinces of Manchuria. But things were smoldering, and it seems quite fitting that into this world in 1927, Werner Herzenberg brought his understanding that the speed and position of particles around a nucleus could not be precisely known. He called it the uncertainty principle. America, neon lit and traveling the freeway, continued to go its own way. By the mid-20s, Chicago had over 10,000 nightclubs and bars playing music. In 1927, to his suite at Chicago's Metropole Hotel, Al Capone summoned the press and announced his retirement.
From the nothingness of a small-time bouncer, Scarface Al has risen to control a crime and vice syndicate that grosses $100 million a year.
He was at the peak of his power and notoriety. He was 28 years old. And the blue-white diamond in the pinky ring on his left hand weighed 11 carats. He had 20 years of life left and would spend 11 of them in prison. Most Americans didn't patronize the nightclubs and the bars. They, in fact, the world, went to the movies. Investment in films skyrocketed from $78 million in 1921 to $550 million in 1930. In the middle of that span, there was, of course, one particular catalyst: the talkies. The first of them, the jazz singer, had 354 words of dialogue, which mostly came out of the mouth of Al Jolson, born Asa Julson in Lithuania.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Tootsie? All right. I'll give it a...
And the jazz singer is part sound and part silent.
Goodbye.
And when the sound stops and it reverts to being a silent film with intertitles and heavy music over it, it seems to go back about 25 years. It's not just 5 minutes. It really seems extraordinary.
The effect of the talkies was extraordinary. Movie audiences jumped from 60 million in 1927 to 100 million in 1930. But the greatest light of a golden summer shone not from the silver screen, but from the baseball diamond, which immortally saw the slugfest between 2 Yankees, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. Ruth broke his own home run record, and those Yankees probably were the greatest team ever to play the game. Which was not the biggest story of the year. That belonged to Lindy.
Charles Augustus Lindbergh will attempt what no man has ever dared. He will attempt to fly the Atlantic non-stop, New York to Paris, alone, all alone.
I mean, the dramatic moment there is the 20th of May, 1927. Fox actually has pictures and sound from Charles Lindbergh taking off from Roosevelt Field to head off to France on the first major transatlantic flight. And that is edited so quickly, that's actually shown in at least one New York cinema that evening, in fact.
Now the ordeal begins. The Lone Eagle heads out into the uncharted void above open seas, where none before has ventured alone and lived. And hour by hour, the world below waits and waits and waits.
Lindbergh flew for 33 hours to win the Arctic Prize, $25,000, offered by New York hotelier Raymond Arctic for the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris, where 150,000 people met him at Le Bourget. That night, at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, they danced the Lindy Hop. And "Lindy's done it," they shouted. "Lindy's done it." Lindy was 25, and his flight was, according to one American newspaper, the greatest event since the resurrection. On June the 11th, the USS Memphis, with Lindbergh on board, steamed towards the Washington Naval Dockyards, accompanied by 4 destroyers, 88 aeroplanes, 2 giant dirigibles, and countless small boats. He was given a 21-gun salute, and his arrival was the first coast-to-coast broadcast.
You have seen the affection of the people of France for the people of America demonstrated to you.
By the time of Lindbergh's flight, 1/3 of the money Americans spent on furniture was going on radios. On June the 13th, perhaps the largest crowd ever to gather, between 4 and 5 million people, cheered him, on whom 1,800 tons of ticker tape and confetti, some hats, and inadvertently the odd telephone directory poured down, and cost $16,000 to clean off the streets of New York. We have now entered the age of instant news and instant celebrity. When news, then as now, flares and fizzles quickly. Eight months after the Paris flight, a New York editor wired his reporter, who was covering Lindbergh's Latin American tour. The wire, no longer interested in progress reports, read, "No more unless he crashes." In 1927, the BBC adopted as its motto the scriptural promise, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." And more than 2.5 million British homes tuned into its first outside broadcast, a horse race. But no one had any experience as a commentator, and finding the right tone was a challenge. The last words of journalist G.F. Allison's call of the Derby were, "He nears the judge! Leap then, brave heart! Look! Nothing can catch him now!" In July 1927, a meeting of the 4 central bankers, British, American, French and German, convened at the Long Island mansion of Egdon Mills, Under-Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. They knew that ahead lay a rocky road which would require a brave heart and then some. The American Benjamin Strong had already decided on his strategy to dampen down the gathering crisis. He would cut U.S. interest rates, famously acknowledging to Charles Rist of the Banque de France that this would give the stock market a small shot of whiskey. Rates were cut by 0.5%. The result was immediate, and it was not a shot of whiskey. By year's end, the Dow had risen 20%. In January 1928, the Munich police reported that the advances of the National Socialist movement repeatedly claimed by Hitler are not true. They added that meetings attended by 300 to 400 people in 1926 now have an audience of at most 60 to 80 members. Things were perhaps looking up, and peace was in the air. On August the 27th, 15 nations gathered in Paris to sign a pact named for its sponsors, U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and his French counterpart Aristide Briand. Kellogg-Briand, or the Pact of Paris, bound each signatory to agree that the settlement or solution of all disputes or conflicts, of whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them, shall never be sought except by pacific means. So were ushered in what historian David Thompson called the strange rose-tinted years. In the course of 1928, 33 powers signed the pact. Italy was one of them. The number would reach 65. But none of them ever ratified the pact for peace. In 1928, Stalin, the Soviet Union also signed the Paris Pact, announced that he would put the Soviet Union in a motor car and the peasant in a tractor. And by 1939, 20 million people, some voluntarily, had been moved from the country to take industrial jobs in the town. Not all of the world was as heads-down industrious, as a tour group from the British Lord's Day Observance Society, which went on a study tour to observe European dissolution, saw for themselves. They reported on frivolity, hilarity, betting, gambling, excitement, and revelries. Our Sunday in Paris, they declared, was a day of desecration we shall never forget. This was a Parisian heyday. Paris, according to Gertrude Stein, was where the 20th century was. Jazz clubs and cabarets, expats and native genius. These were les années folles, the mad years, the time when Paris became the fashion capital.
It's the fashion centre of the world. There are fashion shows. There's a whole industry which is based on the midinette, the seamstress. So this fashion industry is based on a tremendous exploitation of young female workers. But it's tremendously successful, particularly in the 1920s, and people move, the couturiers move from simply producing clothing into the sort of perfume and cosmetics industry. So you've got Chanel, you've got Jean Patou sets up his business, and so it's a very exciting place in that way.
The leading designers went into ready-to-wear and launched a fashion revolution. Houses like those of Chanel, Lalonde, and Patou introduced their first pret-a-porter collections. In this world, the surprise is not that America had more cars than France. It is that Kansas had more cars than France. From 1922 to 1927, profits rose on the Wall Street Stock Exchange as 75% of stocks climbed. It was this momentum that Benjamin Strong, its governor, was hoping to slow when in February the Federal took the rate back up to 5%. The change could slow or briefly stop the trend, but not reverse it.
So this is an era of very high company profits, and these company profits fed into Wall Street, and this, by the mid-1920s, starts off an expansion in Wall Street.
Through the 20s, the stock of General Motors rose 20-fold, RCA 70-fold. These were the grails for which the 1 in 10 American households that had money invested in the stock market were groping.
By the mid-1920s, the American economy is doing so well. People begin to talk about the end of poverty, the end of the business cycle, which means permanent prosperity. You don't have to worry about economic downturns. You don't have to worry about investment.
It's only money. Americans are rolling in the stuff. There's cream in every cup of coffee, plenty of salt in every stew, and never have so many had so much of both.
Before the crash, RCA, the sweetheart stock, was trading 10,000% above its level of 5 years previously. The person who invested $100 in 1924 was a millionaire in 1929 without lifting a finger. And that, too, was the American dream. Such was the American boom that even when by 1928 the USA had become the world's leading exporter, exports accounted for little more than 6% of national income. The trouble was that from around the middle of 1928, the boom detached from any known reality, almost doubling the value of the market against only a modest rise in profits.
Not so gradually, not so slowly. The market goes up a little, then it goes down a lot.
And as the real economy began to slow down, it was quite clear that many businesses were not going to be as profitable as those people buying stocks in them anticipated. And therefore, there was a great hesitation on the part of investors. And these series of hesitations and fluctuations in the stock market came to an almighty crash.
On the eve of the crash, President Hoover was universally respected, characterized by the novelist Sherwood Anderson as someone who had never known failure. He was a thoughtful, progressive politician who noted, in accepting his party's nomination in 1928, that a new era and new forces have come into our economic life. They had, but he failed to recognize what they were.
And the buoyancy and sometimes delirium of the 20s, everything is possible. Dance the night away 5 nights a week. Get whatever alcohol you need, even if it's illegal, because, my goodness, America is a good place. Well, that sense of possibility completely collapses.
Hoover's record-breaking victory of 1928 would be easily surpassed by his record-breaking defeat 4 years later, when Time magazine dubbed him President Reject. Not just the mighty fell, the lowly, the market, the optimism. The 20s were about to crash to the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. between 1913 and 1929, the total value of global exports rose by 66%. But this was not an evenly shared global recovery. British exports rose by 15%, German by 33%, French by 50%. But those of the USA rose by 200%. Despite such success, America refused to consider cancelling or even rescheduling the vast sums owed to her by France and Britain.
Britain had had to borrow an awful lot of money from the United States during the First World War to support all her allies, and she thought that Britain ought to have forgiven this debts. And Britain says, how can you ask us to pay this when everyone has suffered? And America says, in the words of President Calvin Coolidge, they hired the money, didn't they?
The Young Plan, named for the American banker who devised it, revisited the issue of reparations in the context of America's position on the issue of debt. Under the Young Plan, in order to pay inter-allied debt, France would retain only 40% of reparations received from Germany, and the UK 22%. The balance, funds the US loaned to Germany to pay reparations, made their way back across the Atlantic.
You're seeing sort of the reparations going from Germany to Britain and France straight back to Washington, and then the Dawes and Young Plan's loans going then to Germany. So you're getting this sort of nice, neat sort of circle of money being flowing around.
The world was setting itself up for something, but no one was quite sure what. In global economics, there can be many reasons for disaster. The least likely and most reliable is a surfeit of optimism. And it was optimism that overheated Wall Street with disastrous results. In his March 1929 inauguration, Herbert Hoover had told the American people, "We are steadily building up a new race and a new civilization." He could survey an economy in which the average price of stocks on Wall Street had risen by 25% in 1928 and 35% in the first months of 1929.
There is this genuine celebration of traffic, of mobility, of transport, of commotion, of speed. And all these are wrapped up in this utopian vision of, if you like, a New York that appears to the eyes of people who visit as a miracle from a distant future era.
But something went wrong. Hoover was later to say that the trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy. But he didn't say it at the time.
October 29, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange is in a panic. Frantic investors have scrambled to unload their stocks at any price.
At the time of the crash, there were 1.5 million unemployed in the US. By 1932, the figure had risen to 12 million. How did it happen?
There was nominally an institution entrusted with regulating the market. That was the Federal Reserve, but it had only been in existence for 16 years at that time. It had never had a crisis of this magnitude to deal with. And they make precisely the wrong decision about what to do, because once they realize that credit has been given much too liberally, the impulse, intuitive thing is to restrict credit. And so that's what they do. They make credit hard to get. But in an economic downturn, the most important thing is not to restrict credit, but to ease credit so that the debtors have access to funds that they can pay off their debts.
The market opened steady on October the 24th, but then at 11 a.m., it was overwhelmed by sell orders deluging from all over the country. In an hour, 20% had come off the main indices, and RCA, had fallen 35%. Rumours fled. By noon, a crowd of 10,000 people stood in Wall Street, gawping. The 6 major banks moved to support the trading floor, splashing between $20 and $30 million on blue-chip stocks, so that by day's end, the falls had been clawed back and rested at 6% down. The market steadied until the 29th, Black Tuesday.
Everyone wants to sell. No one wants to buy. Suddenly, even the most gilt-edged securities are practically valueless.
By day's end, 9 million shares had changed hands, and $14 billion had simply vanished from the value of the market. The next day, before the market opened, the New York Federal, without reference to the Federal Reserve Board, injected $50 million into the banking system. But the sell-off continued. During the day, the New York Federal injected a further $65 million, and in the last 15 minutes of trading, the market rallied. By late November, the Dow was steady at a level 40% down from its giddy top. Down to what analysts, when the bubble was at its fattest, had said was its true worth. $50 billion had been wiped from the value of stocks. The mysterious force of group psychology that had inflated the bubble had deflated the bubble, and now, with particularly good cause, retreated in extreme and prudent sobriety. Vehicle registrations fell by 25%. AT&T was down by 1/3. General Motors had halved. US Steel came back more than 40%, and so it went on. Radio sales in New York are said to have halved, and people, inevitably, were thrown out of work. If stupidity got us into this mess, then why can't it get us out? Asked the American humorist Will Rogers.
Because of these human errors that were made in policy, make what had been a moderate to severe event into the most catastrophic depression in American history.
In November 1929, an article in The Economist, under the heading Reactions of the Wall Street Slump, wondered what might happen next, and reassuringly noted that the experts are agreed that there must be some setback, but there is not yet sufficient evidence to prove that it will go to the length of producing a general industrial depression. Perhaps the experts had been examining the wrong entrails. Certainly, they were in bad odor. "Don't tell my mother I'm a banker," ran a vaudeville joke. "She thinks I play piano in a brothel."